who was Alexander? I want to get more into the Alexander technique. I want to know who he is or who she is and what is the basis of the technique. I mean, I know you said making yourself aware.
So FM, Frederick Matthias Alexander was an Australian actor, and in the late 1880s, early 1890s, in Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne, Australia, he was an actor, and he'd performed for very rowdy tin miners, and they didn't have public address systems back then, so he'd strain to try to project his voice to fill the room. And as he strained, he started losing his voice, and so his whole career as an actor was threatened because he repeatedly lost his voice, and nobody was able to tell him what was wrong. So he finally sat himself down in a room filled with mirrors and kind of looked at what he was doing when he was trying to project his voice, and he saw that he was tilting his head back and compressing his neck and kind of tightening his whole body as he was straining to project his voice. And all of that made it more difficult to project his voice, and he was gasping for breath, and he was rapidly losing his voice. So he tried to stop doing that. He tried to stop tipping his head back and tightening his neck and tightening his whole body, and he was shocked to find that he could not stop. So he eventually developed this system, which we now know as the Alexander technique, which involves, first of all, noticing what your patterns of unnecessary tension are, and then inhibiting those patterns. So inhibition in this sense is a neuromuscular term. It's not, psychological shame term. We're just talking about not doing the things that hurt you. And then he found that by thinking his directions of directing his head forward and up through his thinking and thinking about the width of his back and the length of his back and thinking of these directions of expansion instead of contraction, he was able to reach his full space in the world and to effortlessly project his voice. And it took him about 18 months to make this discovery, and then very quickly word spread. And other actors and like clergymen who, would get clergyman's voice as they'd get hoarse on Sundays trying to preach. And eventually doctors heard about this, and soon he moved to London to teach his methods, and he was making the equivalent of $1 million a year teaching this technique in London about 110 years ago. He finally died in 1956, but not before training up several dozen teachers who've gone on to train more. There are about 4,000 Alexander technique teachers in the world today. Many of them teach in the performing arts, so it's generally actors, musicians, public speakers, and people in performance who are the most likely to take Alexander technique lessons.